Okay, we fixed tank, guys. This is the third rework project that we've done. We've done DPS and we've done support. And the idea of this is that if we're going to complain about a character's design, we need to provide something that's going to be a little bit better. And this wasn't not just me sitting there thinking, what should I do to fix Roadhog? Well, no, this was something, a huge Discord rework project with literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of suggestions for each character done over the course of several weeks. It was almost 30 hours of work. And the idea is that we still have a lot of tanks that in the Overwatch 1 to Overwatch 2 transition have not made that transition very smoothly. For example, Wrecking Ball is a character that was really fun in Overwatch 1, but seems to have a lot of issues in Overwatch 2. And what we try to do is address some of those issues, but not just the tanks that haven't aged well, like Doomfist, Wrecking Ball, and D.Va. But characters, I guess actually going back to Doomfist, characters like Doomfist that have received some reworks and changes for Overwatch 2, but maybe still are missing something. And to be honest with you, a couple of characters like Orisa and Roadhog that have received revamps of sorts, but are really still very frustrating to play against and very frustrating to play with. What can we do to make those characters more skillful, more enjoyable, and more dynamic in their design? So this is basically a compilation of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of suggestions for each character. We went through these live on stream. You can check out my Spilo 2 channel where we did each one of the characters. And we talk about balancing all of these ideas from my bias just a little bit. So I think that's really important to understand is that there's going to be some inherent bias with all of these reworks. My bias is that I like more dynamics. I don't like quite as harsh strengths or weaknesses. I don't like what I call caricatures, where a character only does one thing and does it really well, but struggles against anything else. It leads to a counterpick situation. It leads to be very frustrating to play against, very frustrating to play with. I like having more room for counterplay, as Yeatle would say, where there's opportunities for Wrecking Ball to counterplay CC, but if you don't have CC, he's not an unkillable behemoth. I think that's one of the problems with Wrecking Ball right now, and that is applicable to, I think, all of the tanks that we're going to be going over today. I like a slight mobility creep when necessary. A character like Wrecking Ball doesn't need more mobility. A character like Winston or D.Va doesn't need more mobility necessarily, but there are some aspects of certain of the more immobile characters because they're so immobile, because they have no ability to move around the map. They become these basically unkillable turrets, which leads to that caricature design, which can be very frustrating to play with and against in a lot of situations. And it can make the character, in my opinion, just a little bit less fun. Now, I know that not a lot of people will agree with that opinion. I made a video about that earlier, but that's my take on things. And again, that's going to be part of my bias that influences this rework. I think even if you don't agree with my mobility takes, there's going to be a lot of other changes that you may or may not agree with as well. And the other thing with my bias is I like skill curves. I like skill curves that aren't not that every character has to be like Wrecking Ball level of difficulty to play, but I think as you get better at the character, you should be rewarded with more skill, more challenge, and more value out of that challenge. And it feels like a lot of characters don't have that same level of challenge. Some characters get too much value by just existing. And some characters don't, even if you're really good at them, you don't get a lot of reward for it, right? So if you're really good at the character, I'm not able to I'm still dying to the same crappy crowd control, even if I know all these crazy techs. And I think that that's something that we need to bring the floor up and we need to bring the ceiling up as well to allow more healthy skill curve design. Again, I want to clarify this is not just me. Some of these are my ideas, but the majority of these are actually not my ideas initially. These are my community's ideas. So big shout out to my Discord and YouTube and Twitch community for helping come out with these. This is my vision communicated through other people's ideas is the best way to look at that. Some ideas are a little bit out there. I think some of these characters, for example, the Roadhog, it's just the character design is so difficult to work with. I do think that you might have to do some crazy things. So even though I don't necessarily love all of these ideas, and I'm certainly not super confident in all of these reworks, it would be something that I would love to see in experimental mode, at least to see, because I think you never know. Maybe it's stupid, maybe it's not. We can't really know until we try. And again, to clarify, I don't have an interacted the devs with any of this stuff. This is just, if I'm going to complain about a character's design, I need to provide something to show for it. And I don't necessarily have any hopes that all these are going to go through. But you know what? I can say that at least I put in the work in. I have a vision of what I want. And also, it was just a lot of fun to do. So even if these things aren't perfect, I do think that these things are worth trying and experimental. And that's pretty much it. So let's actually start with, let me actually pull up Wrecking Ball really fast here. So I have these on the notes. I'm going to go through each hero individually. And I'm going to have the notes posted up here so you guys can actually check some of the notes that we have here. So let's talk about Wrecking Ball. What are our complaints? Some of the initial complaints are, okay, first off, might have some new stuff coming for Wrecking Ball. I heard that they're doing some tweaks to Wrecking Ball, so keep that in mind. Complaints about Wrecking Ball. Too much survivability, too hard to kill. It's the hiding of the head hitbox, it's the adaptive shields. The guy feels like honestly unkillable in a lot of circumstances, but If you have crowd control, if you have a sleep dart or a discord or a hog hook or a junkrat trap, the character just instantly dies. So I think a lot of the problems with Wrecking Ball is that he has too much survivability with an asterisk. And that's definitely a problem for a lot of the tank casts, where their survivability is so tied up into one aspect that if you counter that one aspect, they just freaking die. And Wrecking Ball has limited counterplay with CC. He's got some counterplay, but limited counterplay. I think I would like to see Wrecking Ball have a slightly higher peak of power. One of the Wrecking Ball's best things that he does is he's able to go in and out and in and out and provide consistent, constant pressure, but it feels very hard to actually secure kills sometimes. So maybe something that we could take a look at here. I also think that he suffers from the tank passive. I want to shout out to Yeetle for really bringing to light this in his Everything Wrong with Wrecking Ball video, where basically you talk about the crowd control aspects of Wrecking Ball, some of the more frustrating aspects to play versus for sure, but he is completely unable to actually displace tanks with his boop and with his slam, something that in Overwatch 2 is a very important core part of his identity. It was disrupting and slamming large portions of the enemy team, but right now, with the tank passive, you can't really displace or disrupt the enemy tank much at all. And while that's, probably a balance thing to an extent, it definitely is a nerf and something that's not really been compensated for in a result. There's a lot of other quality of life things as well, complaints. There's a lot of bugs, losing fireball, pile driver issues, and we're going to try and address a lot of these issues overall. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to buff his resistance and his dealing with crowd control a little bit, while also slightly nerfing his overall survivability versus compositions that don't have crowd control. And then mostly with Wrecking Ball, a lot of quality of life tweaks. So it's hard to define what's the difference between a buff, what's the difference between a quality of life tweak, and what's the difference between just a bug fix. We're going to try and talk about a couple of the differences here. And regardless of whether you define it as a flat buff or quality of life thing, I think these things would be helpful. So first thing here, body blocking not an issue. One of the big things that the Yeetle talks about is if you could just roll through the enemy team and slightly bump them out of the way, especially 200 HP targets, that would be huge. This is a momentum killer, and it is quite literally a killer for Wrecking Ball many times. When a hero the size of Tracer can actually disrupt and displace you, and it's actually very hard for you to move around them. So you have this 10,000 pound mech, maybe not quite that heavy, but a very heavy mech that actually gets bullied a lot by smaller hitboxes, and that can not only body block your escape and exit routes, but it can also kill your fireball. So I would love to see maybe not exactly a major boop, but a slight bump for any time Wrecking Ball goes through you. I would also like, while we're on the topic of quality of life changes / buffs, I would love to see Ball keep the form he was CC'd in certain circumstances. We actually did, let me actually get my notes pulled up here. We actually did a full trial and error of what actually keeps Ball in form. And here's what we have. Let's actually go down the list here really quick. Hog Hook pulls you out of Ball form. Sigma Rock pulls you out. Honest Sleep Dart pulls you out. Sombra Hack pulls you out. EMP pulls you out. Ryan, you stay in Ball form, but Shatter, you're pulled out. Doom, you stay in. Brig Shield Bash while in Rally keeps you in. Casty Hinder keeps you in. Junkrat Trap keeps you in. May Blizzard keeps you in. Orisa Javelin keeps you in. So what you could do is, because there's some inconsistency, I think it's probably more to do with how the stuns are coded with Overwatch 2. You could go through the list and be like, which one of those is not fair? I would say a manual hack from Sombra, if you really want to give a big quality of life buff to Wrecking Ball. A manual hack from Sombra should cancel grapple, maybe even cancel fireball potentially, but I don't think it should cancel ball form. I think Sombra does enough damage with it as it is, and she already does well versus the character overall. So we could go through the list individually and be like, hey, that shouldn't be, that shouldn't be, that shouldn't be. You could even do things like, hey, a Ryan struggles versus Wrecking Ball. Why don't we let Ryan pin push Ball out of ball form? Maybe that would be a small quality of life buff for Ryan into Wrecking Ball, something that he's not very good at. But you can basically go down the list of changes and be like, hey, which of these changes should pull Ball out of Wrecking Ball form and which shouldn't? Because to be honest with you, I don't really see a whole lot of rhyme or reason, at least from an external viewpoint. And that would be one of the easy ways to help him deal with crowd control, by making it feel less punishing. Because the big benefit is that if you stay in ball form, you can move faster and you don't have a head box. So something to keep in mind. I think also reducing tank passive effectiveness. We talked about maybe the CC, the boop defense that a lot of tanks have. If we're able to reduce that slightly for Wrecking Ball specifically, like he has a way to penetrate the tank passive effectiveness, not completely. I don't want Reinhardt's going flying across the map. I do not miss those days. But maybe just to a little bit of extent to where that's at least more of an option. Same thing with Pile Driver. I don't think you remove it, just reduce the effectiveness. Another little tweak there, people were talking about like a quality of life change. Maybe the mines having 5 more HP so that they don't get immediately cleared by 50 damage things. Specifically, Doomfist Slam will clear entirely mine's quality of life change. Now, this is where things get pretty juicy. So I want you to notice adaptive shields here. So adaptive shields, you can see the number in my middle of my screen. It always gives 100 HP regardless of how many targets are near me. But it increases in targets depending the number of enemies are nearby. So the more enemies that are nearby, the more shielding that I get from adaptive shields. So that can mean a lot of things. First off, it doesn't really help you a ton versus crowd control. You can still get bursted through it pretty quickly. But when there is no crowd control, it can put basically a ball into this unkillable behemoth, where if you get a 3 or a 4 adaptive shields, you're talking 400, 500 more armor. In compositions that don't have crowd control, you're just not dying anyway. So you have all this glut of survivability, but you're still relatively fragile to crowd control. So what's the solution? And this is where I want to introduce something that's going to be coming up a few more times in today's rework thing, which is a parry mechanic. And a parry mechanic, for those of you who haven't played other games, is essentially a couple of what we call iframes, where it allows you to defend versus certain burst damage, but not burst damage in a Ball's form, but crowd control, where Ball is actually immune to crowd control while applying his adaptive shields. But unlike other games where you have these invulnerability frames, Ball has invulnerability HP. So think of it as a Zarya bubble. It's a 100 HP Zarya bubble that prevents Ball from being crowd controlled. Now you're thinking 100 HP, that's a lot of HP. Or maybe you're thinking that's not a lot of HP. We don't really want it to be a lot of HP. We want it to be enough for, if it's used at a proper time, gives Ball a little bit of tankiness, survivability versus that HP. But that first 100 HP is CC immune. It's a tiny little bubble, tiny little shield that prevents him from being hog hooked, just like a Zarya bubble. There's nothing really new here. Now, you're going to notice that, like, oh, it's going to be so broken, he's going to be invulnerable to CC for the first 100 HP. Well, you're going to need to compensate that, rewarding the Ball for timing things well with his adaptive shields. Now you need to compensate that by reducing the amount of total HP that adaptive shields give. So as it gives right now, it's 100 flat out. Maybe that's the CC immune bubble. You need to compensate that by rewarding the Ball with less HP. So it gets 100 per target now. Consider that reducing that to 50. Consider reducing that to 75, so that his total amount of HP that he can have is significantly less. But if he times his adaptive shields well, he's actually able to outplay crowd control well. One of the things that would be a huge, huge buff, but you notice that there's counterplay here. You don't necessarily have to use your crowd control immediately in Ball. You could try to bait the initial adaptive shields, break the 100 HP, which is quite easy to break, and then CC him afterwards. So again, it introduces counterplay on both sides of the equation, and that's what we need more of in Overwatch 2. A couple of other quality of life changes as well. I think reducing the minimum pile driver. So I think minimum pile driver damage, let me actually look that up. It might be 20. I couldn't believe it when I saw it. I was like, wait, it does only 20 damage if you miss the epicenter. The middle of grapple, a pile driver does a lot of damage. It does 20 damage. So I think increasing that to 40 damage would really, really help Ball in this AoE crowd control, large damage, multiple, like his ability to function versus brawl comps. I think that would be a nice, again, I say quality of life change. Obviously it's a buff. It's a buff, but it's not a significant buff. It just allows him to go focus more on AoE pressure, which is something that I think that he could use a little bit of help with. Couple other things. So there's a lot of things. One of the big complaints with Wrecking Ball mains is how quickly you use Fireball. Lose Fireball. You can lose Fireball to Doom Slam. You can lose Fireball, Brig Shield Bash, even from the side. I believe Winston's Leap, Bastion's Grenade, potentially. Sigma's Hyperspheres, Zarya's Right Click, Reinhardt's Hammer, Pharah's Rockets, Junkrat's Primary Fire, Soldier's Helix, Diva's Remake, and somebody also said that even just a melee slows down Wrecking Ball. So there's a lot of things. Wrecking Ball's Fireball is very fragile to being disrupted and slowed down, which really hurts the character's not only survivability, but also the 50 damage that comes from Fireball. So something that they would want to look at, I think, as well. So yeah, I think, again, quality of life buff, take a look at what is adjusting, what is screwing over Fireball. And now let's move on to a couple of a little bit of some weird changes here. So adaptive shields reduces CC duration by 50%. This was like an alternative to the bubble solution. Somebody also thought that maybe reduce adaptive shield cooldown. So maybe if we make this, we could also, the problem with adaptive shields, it is a 15-second cooldown. So maybe we could reduce the duration, right? So it lasts for 6-7 seconds, right? Reduce it to 3 seconds, but lower the cooldown slightly. That's a very Sumito solution, but I actually think it's a potential idea. And then also going back to that Fireball, I think we could reduce the Fireball threshold to a percentage of max speed. So let's say that you're slowed, you could still achieve Fireball if you reach a certain percentage of your max speed. Like if you're being actively slowed, but you're able to get to a certain percentage. So it's not like Fireball procs when you reach 15 meters per second. Fireball procs when you reach 75% of your max speed, whatever that is, if you're slowed. I know it's a little bit complicated, but just trust me, bear me with that. Wrecking Ball mains are going to know exactly what I'm talking about. I think that's mostly it we have for Wrecking Ball. Again, I think the idea is that like give him more counterplay with crowd control, address some of those quality of life changes, and definitely an overall nerf of survivability, because nothing is more frustrating than playing versus Wrecking Ball as like a Lucio comp, a Moira comp, where there's just really no way to kill him because you don't have that burst CC. And there's nothing more frustrating for the Wrecking Ball than playing versus those crazy CC comps and having no way of actually getting anything done. Okay, so that's all for Wrecking Ball. Let's actually move on to the next character here. What's our next character here? Doomfist. Oh boy, this is one I'm going to be saucy. So Doomfist was a tricky one because Doomfist is like Wrecking Ball, a very, very passionate hero. Let's put it that way. Where there's a lot of people that play the character a lot. They have a lot of crazy ideas. Doomfist was definitely one of the characters where like had some absolutely back crap insane suggestions from the Doomfist community, and a lot of things that I honestly just had to admit ignorance on because I don't play the character enough and I'm not familiar with the nuances. Now, one big disclaimer: we are not going to talk almost at all about the many bugs that this character has. I do agree that if you fix the bugs in this character, if you got proper coding with this character, a lot of his issues, especially at the higher level, would be solved. So we're going to focus on a couple of other things outside of that. So let's address that. Problems. Right now, Doomfist has a lot of crowd control. Playing versus Doomfist can be a frustrating experience because not only is it the punch, but it's also the empowered punch, and even the slow from the ultimate is some of the most CC-heavy things that this game has to offer right now. A lot of CC tied up in one hero. Power block is dull to play with and against. It's not exciting doing this as a Doomfist. There isn't a lot of room for nuance or counterplay with that. And then also playing against it is kind of boring, right? Even being the guy that feeds the Doomfist, you're like, oh boy, I feel like a total jackass. And playing with that jackass, you're like, wow, somebody fed Doomfist punch. What could I actually do about that? Like that, I had no way of like playing around that. And I think that can be very frustrating to play versus. So I don't like power block. It's not a very interesting ability, at least in how it's currently focused. It's a lot of outside of Doomfist control where your efficacy can be if the enemy team makes a mistake. Now, I do see a lot of people that are like, oh, then what do you think about Zarya Bubble? Isn't that the same thing? And the answer is no, because Zarya Bubble can allow the Zarya to take space. If you do not shoot the Zarya Bubble, the Zarya does more damage to you. It takes more space to you. But Doomfist block, all it does is buy him time. He can't actively take a lot of space with that necessarily. It doesn't enable him to play more aggressively. So even a zero charge Zarya that you're never shooting her bubble, if she's allowed to take positions because you're not shooting her, that's a useful bubble. And it can also enable teammates, and something that Doomfist block doesn't have that level of nuance. So anyway, inconsistency with that, obviously like inconsistency with power punch leads to inconsistency overall. Obviously, ultimate is an issue as well. Is the ultimate too broken? Is it too weak? It's one of those ultimates that feels very inconsistent in the value that it gets. It could be basically a guaranteed one-shot, or it can be totally useless, the worst tank ultimate in the game. And then bugs XD. Obviously, as you said, we're not going to talk as much about the bugs. So one last disclaimer. We are not going to be talking about, I know I'm going to make some people mad with this, we are not going to be talking about uppercut. I saw a lot of really reasonable, interesting solutions and suggestions about uppercut rework, but that is something that is beyond my pay grade. I think that would be a very high risk, high reward rework where it could be the potential to where like that glass cannon of a Doomfist where you replace uppercut with uppercut, or power block with uppercut. I don't know if that's going to work in Overwatch 2. I don't know if we're going to be okay with having a tank that's that aggressively focused. That's basically that much of a glass cannon. Maybe it would work, maybe it wouldn't. It's not what we're going to be looking at today. I'm not saying that suggestion is bad. That's just something that we're not going to be looking at today. Okay, so ultimate. Let's talk about the ultimate first. So first off, reduce Doomfist lockout window and ultimate usability. So this is something that a lot of Doomfist mains are familiar with, where you press the ability after the ultimate, and there's a slight hesitation before you can even use anything, before you can shoot, before you can punch, before you can slam, before you can even block. And the reason why that's bad is if you land on an Ana and you don't kill the Ana, well, the Ana can sleep dart you before you can use an ability. And you might be like, well, that's good. That improves counterplay. Like, at least give her an opportunity to hit the sleep dart. The problem is that it's a lot easier for the Ana to hit the sleep dart than it is for the Doomfist to avoid that said sleep dart. So I do think that there needs to be an opportunity to reduce that lockout just at least a little bit, at least to toy with it. Not by major, maybe with 0.1 seconds, right? Where there's a window where it's actually pretty tricky from both ends, but right now it feels a little bit too easy to consistently land the CC after the ultimate. There's another idea here. So this one's going to be very tweaky, where the ultimate could be more of an AoE slow HP generator and less of a one-shot. So you could increase the overall radius of the ultimate So you can see the outer circle, right? You can increase that radius slightly and leave the slow and reduce the HP regen. So it'd be almost like an AoE debuff, essentially, that you're putting with less of the emphasis on the one shot. And you're still getting a large amount of HP from the overhealth. You're still getting a little bit of the heal from the ultimate, and you're now just applying a large AoE slow. Now, a lot of you guys will be like, oh, CC, but it's an idea. It's an idea. At least gives the ultimate some sort of a clear identity. The other way to look at it is to basically use it, put it as it is right now, which is, hey, you go for the one shot and you give yourself another life. But basically, instead of having the heal that heals over time, one of the problems with the heal over time as it functions is it encourages Doomfist to sit in the ultimate for longer. Problem with that is that gives the enemy team time to generate their HP back, to set up around your ultimate, and also get the cooldowns back that they have to deal with you. So like, let's say you go in really hard, they're 1 HP, pop the ultimate, right? Well, if you're like regenerating, now let's go, well, then now you have to start all over again. So I think a lot of people, what I would like to see in terms of a minor quality of life buff is to see more of the heal frontlined. I can't remember. Put it in the front, right? Basically, put it into where when you immediately pop the ultimate, you immediately heal for 100 burst right as soon as you press Q, and then 50 over time. And so that means that you can actually jump into the ultimate and just slam out, and you already have 150, 200 HP. And it's like you can stay in the ultimate for more healing, but it's not as punishing. It's not as rewarding to sit in it for as long as it's okay for you to pop out of it. You'll still get the sustain. Also, potentially Doom Circle is slightly bigger. Maybe the Doom drops a little bit faster out of the ultimate. I'm very torn on that change because I think if you come too fast out of the ultimate, it becomes a guaranteed one-shot and a squishy. And I just don't like that. I don't like any ultimate that's a guaranteed one-shot and a squishy. I mean, even something like a Dragon Blade or a Pulse Palm requires more skill. And I think that that's just something that I don't want to see on Doomfist. I don't like it with Bastion. I don't like it with this character either. But I think you also, if you were to do something like that, you could definitely reduce the slow, because that's easily the second worst thing about the ultimate is having to deal with the slow post-ult. And I think if you do a lot of these things, maybe you tweak the ultimate so it's a little bit less strong with the heal, or maybe there's other ways of leaning into it. I do think that the ult cost right now is a bit of an issue. It is a little bit too high, especially after the quote-unquote buff. I think that that's something that you need to be doing with a character to make him a little bit more viable. Okay, now this is where we get sauced up, so hold on tight, boys. We're going to talk about Empowered Punch, and we're going to look a lot at Empowered Punch. So Empowered Punch, I would like to see it tried to be utilized like Zarya, where it is a spectrum. It is not an on or an off. So the more charge that you build with your Empowered Punch, there will be a number in the middle of your screen that generates from 0 to 40, 0 to 50, 0 to 100. I don't really care however you want to do 0 to 20. When you reach a certain threshold, let's say 0 to 100, you reach 100 charge, 100 damage taken, however it is calculated right now. Instead of getting a glowing punch, it's like Sojourn Rail, where it empowers over time. But when you reach a certain threshold, the only thing that happens is you get a punch reset. If you use your block and you only get 60 or 70, you do more damage. You do more damage with your punch, and you go further with it. However, it's on a spectrum. It's not on or off. It's a non-empowered punch, or it is an empowered punch. It's a partially empowered punch, or a very empowered punch, or a fully empowered punch. In the fully empowered punch, the only difference between that and a partially empowered punch is that you get the cooldown reset, right? There's the difference between a 99 and a 100 charge is almost totally insignificant except for the reset. And I think that's the reason why that would be more useful for the Doomfist. Is for the Doomfist, it feels like, hey, I can actually have control of even a partially empowered punch can still be of use to me. It's something that I can preserve from fight to fight, from moving on. I can build my punch up over time, even if I'd like to. That, for the Doomfist, gives the ability more choice, and more opportunity, and more flexibility with how it's used, and also doesn't feel like it's either good or it's not. I also want to incorporate decay. So charge decay, similar to Zarya, where you lose some of your charge slowly after time, after 2 to 3 seconds. And the reason why this is good is the worst part of Empowered Punch is not feeding it mid-fight, right? When everyone's focusing the Doomfist because he's diving your backline. The worst part about playing versus Doomfist is when your teammates feed Empowered Punch between fights. Like, let's say the fight's starting, it hasn't started yet, and you just see the Doomfist on high ground, and he does this, and Hanzo just throws a log, and Ana sniffs at him, and he feeds Empowered Punch. You're like, crap. And he sits in that Empowered Punch for 15, 20 seconds, then the fight starts, and he just absolutely demolishes you. And that feels really, really bad. Nobody likes that. So I think at this point in time, having that decay means that when Doomfist has more charge, it's mid-fight, when he's earned it, when he's actually at a risk of dying. I think you need to scale Doom Punch damage, Doom Stun accordingly. but it's something to kind of keep in mind here. I think that this is not a end-all be-all solution. I do think this ability is really, really hard to work on. I am not a fan at all of empowered block, but at least at this point in time, it seems like it has a little bit more of a nuanced identity, and there's more ways to utilize it. Okay. Also, little details here. I think that there's a couple of things here, like where the spread of the weapon doesn't really line up with the fall off of the weapon, so it can lead to some incongruency with the damage of his mouse one. So it would just be a really slightly tighter spread that would actually line up with his fall off. There's also, this is a bug, but it's worth pointing out that where his first shot reload on reloading his clip takes longer than the rest of his shots, so it punishes you for fully using your clip. But to me, that's not good game design. This isn't a clip of like a massive side where it's like, hey, if you overheat your Orisa gun, you're gonna get punished. Everybody's using 4 shots with the Doomfist at some point in time, and the fact that you get slightly punished for that seems kind of silly to me. So let's stay in the power block mode. Stay in the power block mode. 2 other things I want to incorporate as well. First off, is probably a little bit less of a movement speed penalty for block, to allow him to move a little bit faster. So right now he slows down during that block animation, which makes him a little bit easier to crowd control him. I think having a little bit less of a movement speed penalty would be really, really nice. And then this is the big one. We're going back to that wrecking ball suggestion. First few frames of block, talking like a quarter of a second here, as he's bringing his arm up, is a parry, CC immune, where it blocks all crowd control while you bring your punch up. You can deflect it almost, essentially. Now, what this type of CC is going to depend. I think it should block hog hook. I should block sleep dart. Umbra hack. I don't know how that would work, because you can't really cancel the hack. It wouldn't count as damage, so she would just hack you again. I don't think it should cancel like Ryan Pen. I don't know if it should cancel accretion from Sigma, but maybe projectiles. Maybe the projectiles, the CC projectiles. And again, you're noticing here that this is not free. Some people were suggesting like, oh, power block should give CC immunity. I don't like that. I think that you should have to. There should be skill involved with CC immunity. It should not be anything like Orisa Fortify, where it's just, hey, you cannot crowd control her now. It should be a skillful choice, and again, it should incorporate counterplay. And can you imagine the amount of skill required to be able to not only properly time power block to generate the most charge, but because now it's not all about empowered or non-empowered punch, you actually have to time your power block well. And you're like, well, wouldn't you just wait to CC? Couldn't the Doomfist just wait and hold it until you start to use your CC? Well, yes, he could. But the problem is, if he's saving power block to counter your crowd control, he's taking damage to the face. He's not blocking damage. He has to sit there and take full damage. And then, oh no, I timed it wrong. Now I get crowd controlled. And I think that's the kind of nuance that we want in play. Now, would it mean that Doomfist is still vulnerable to CC? Yes. But it gives counterplay. And when you have these high skill ceiling characters, they need to be able to be rewarded for outplaying your crowd control. And right now, there just isn't enough opportunity for that. So a lot of crackpot ideas in here. I do like the parry one more so than almost any of the other ideas. And I would love to see that incorporated into Doomfist. Obviously, a character that we have to kind of keep a careful eye on. He's not super popular by a lot of the player base with the amount of crowd control. So you're going to notice that a lot of these things, I probably should put this at the start, but a lot of these changes are buffs. Like, let's be honest here. Like, all the overall wrecking ball changes are buffs. These Doomfist changes are probably buffs. So you might need to adjust the power skill accordingly. But I think like when you buff things to a more healthy standpoint, it's easier to tweak damage numbers and cooldown numbers that will work more appropriately without feeling like the character's just gonna be utter garbage here. Okay, so let's keep moving on. We're done with Doomfist. I think we're moving on to D.Va now. And D.Va was our simplest tank, because I think whereas D.Va has a lot of identity issues, the ways of solving them aren't quite as complicated. So D.Va is probably the most, I would say, the character that got screwed over the most by the 5v5 change. Now, I'm not going to sit here and talk about 5v5, 6v6. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole. However, I do feel like D.Va's identity as a peeler and an enabler of her tank was a major problem. So when we talk about issues with D.Va, Matrix is a really dull expression of survivability, and it's horrible in Overwatch 2. Matrixing somebody else, survivability in Overwatch 2 is so much more selfish. You look at something like a Wrecking Ball, a character that is almost exclusively selfish with survivability. Winston, exclusively selfish with this bubble, almost exclusively. Even Sigma and Reinhardt, a lot of their survivability is more about me, and helping me do better. Now, a lot of you are going to be like a little bit boomerish, no offense, and be like, wow, that's the problem with 5v5. No, that's just a design choice of 5v5. And in many ways, it's a lot better in some aspects. It's worse in some aspects and better in others. But D.Va's Matrix isn't very good at selfish survivability. It's very, 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 very long, but she cannot shoot while she's doing it. And the other problem is that it takes forever to recharge. It lasts for forever, but it takes forever to recharge. I think there's inconsistent ult value. There's also high risk associated with the ult value, especially in higher tiers. Remeching is very dangerous. I think you're very meta dependent with D.Va. So the problem with D.Va is she's got like super high mobility, so she's really good versus these mobile compositions, right? But spam comps, she's too slow. Brawl comps, she's not quite quick enough. She can't do enough damage. I'd never find D.Va to be the best pick in many situations. She's a lot less dynamic than some of the other, even the other dive tanks like Doomfist and Wrecking Ball. The frequency of her mobility is her strength, right? She gets it back very quickly, but also it's not a very far mobility. Like you talk about like Doomfist Punch is so much faster, so much more dynamic. Even Winston, even though his jump is on a longer cooldown, it's so much faster than D.Va. D.Va is just kind of like the frequency mobility, which is really good when there's high ground, but if there's not high ground, D.Va does really poorly. Okay. Vertical specificity. You guys, don't quit your day job. Anyway, so let's talk about D.Va. What are some solutions with D.Va? So again, I've got some crackpot ideas here. Let's talk about them. One of the ideas that I had, a little bit crazy, was I wouldn't mind if let's talk about matrix tweaks here. I wouldn't mind if there was a little bit less matrix for her, somewhere in the 2.5, 2 second, even 1.5 second ballpark. And if you gave her a little bit of shields. Now, people are like, why would you give her shields? I think shields were one of the best changes that Wrecking Ball has given because it gave him a little bit more self-survivability. It meant that his cycles of pressure could go a little bit faster because he wasn't quite as demanding on health packs. He can kind of go in and out a little more. I don't think that would be inappropriate for D.Va. If D.Va had a way to kind of cycle her matrix and cycle cover and cycle boosters and be a little bit less of a heal hog. That's the problem with D.Va, right? She's very much a heal hog, but she doesn't reward it with as much aggression. She's a heal hog that also peels for her team. It's a weird dynamic. I would love to see if they shifted some of her survivability away from just the raw amount of matrix, made the matrix recharge faster, total amount of matrix reduced, and then gave her some ability to regenerate her own HP through shields. Now, you could also argue that if you kept reducing the efficacy of Matrix to a really long, short cooldown, you could allow D.Va to shoot while she's matrixing. Maybe even at a lower potency, like you do less damage while you're matrixing. I don't know. But again, we're thinking about like what are D.Va's problems? It's the inability to be as selfish with her survivability because you can't shoot while you're matrix. Now, I'm not fully on board with being able to shoot while matrix. I think you'd have to be very careful of the balance of that for sure. But it's an idea, especially if we're looking to nerf matrix in other ways. Okay, a couple other changes with her. I think the first thing is that I think she should be able to remech during ultimate right now. And even if it's just half a second or a second faster, that would significantly increase the survivability of the character. There's a lot of ways that you could increase the survivability of the character, but I think this is one of the ways that you could do it to max, because I don't think you could really rework her ultimate entirely. A couple of ideas came for reworks, including like some overdrive things, which I think are fun, but I think if we're honest here, I don't think their ultimate's ever going to change. So finding different ways to allow her to have more utility with the ultimate, because even if it's just a zoning ultimate, D.Va Bomb is okay. It's not totally useless in high ranks. It's just useless because there's so much risk involved. It's not really a second life like so many of the other second life ultimates. Couple other things here. I think tighter fall off and then doing less damage. So D.Va's damage is actually remarkable when it comes to the spread and the fall off. So if you talk about fall off here, you guys probably will be shocked at how little damage that you do at this range. And in fact, it doesn't really get a lot better. And this is full headshots, right? So I would love to see if this character did slightly more damage in closer ranges. We can even set this to like, let's see, what's a good hitbox here? Let's go Roadhog here. Look at the damage that this character does at this range. Right? And you're like, well, that's fine because she's got mobility. Yeah, but her mobility is inconsistent at closing the distances here. And as we already said, because her mobility is slower, Winston's and Doomfist and Wrecking Balls, while are not the best characters right now, at least have quicker mobility to close the distance. D.Va doesn't quite have that. D.Va's a little bit slow in that regard. So I think what would be huge is either she could move slightly faster during her boosters, like 5 meters per second, 3 meters per second faster, or tighten the spread just a little bit and do less damage. You see, this range is not a problem. Okay, well, I did not mean to do that. But this range is not a problem with D.Va, right? You do like a dump truck amount of damage. I mean, that's unreal. That's like some of the best DPS in the game. The problem is that the variance is that at this range, you do actually nothing. And I think maybe that variance is a little bit too extreme, especially when compared to the rest of the tank cast. Because you can see here, this is a fat target. You know, it's not like I'm missing a ton of shots here. Just the fall off is like really hard. So I think a small/minor adjustment in that, slightly less damage, slightly tighter spread would give her a lot more flexibility in the type of compositions that she's played, especially those brawl and spam matchups. Because the concern always with D.Va is if you tighten her spread, is she just going to melt Winston more? Or dive characters in general more. And I think that if you nerf the damage appropriately, I don't think it's as much of an issue. So a lot of tweaks about how fast she moves. I think you could also tweak how fast she moves while she's shooting. So like they already buffed this recently. You could probably buff it even further than that. I'd give her another, another 5-10% of movement speed here. I think these are the small tweaks that in her ultimate that I think this character needs that would make her feel a lot more flexible, a lot more dynamic in how she plays. And then also along the lines addressing how Matrix feels, how it functions in a 5v5 environment where it's used more often than not selfishly. Okay, who do we got next? D.Va, Doomfist. Let's just go down to Orisa here. So I've got something saucy for you guys with Orisa, right? Let's actually pull this up in custom games really fast. So Orisa was one of the toughest ones that we did because we found what are the problems with Orisa. Let me pull up my note here after I pull this up. Okay. Orisa. There we go. We got it. Okay. Let's got Orisa here. Okay. And then I want to change the map here. Let's just do, I don't know, do Dorado. So what are the problems with Orisa? Issues: can only focus the tank because of limited range and mobility options. Orisa, what's going on here? Why are we going slow? Oh, server loader. Okay, there we go. Basically, the problem with Orisa is that she is just the unkillable tank, and she focuses the enemy tank, and she focuses the enemy tank, and she focuses the enemy tank, and she does it again and again and again. Problem is that that's kind of just the necessity. She doesn't really have the mobility or the range that other characters have. Like, it's weird saying that, but like Overwatch 1 Orisa had so much better range with her ult, her shield, and her damage. But Overwatch 2 range is not that great. It's not terrible, but it's definitely not anywhere close, especially because she doesn't have any damage mitigation like a shield anymore. I don't want to go that road with Overwatch 1. I don't want to go back to shield. I don't want to go back to poke Orisa. I want to find something that plays into this character's strengths a little bit more. So you can only focus the tank in many circumstances, which limits your options and makes it very frustrating as a tank player to play into Orisa. Heavily leans into raw survivability, whether it's the amount of armor that she has, whether it's her javelin spin, whether it's her ultimate, whether it's her fortify, crowd control immunity, headshot immunity, 50% or whatever percentage damage, the overhealth. It's actually insane how much survivability this tank has, and that's all she does. Again, OTP, caricature, character design, not good in Overwatch 2. As a result, we have an unkillable anti-tank tank focused on direct dopamine on the enemy tank without meaningful, consistent space creation. Doesn't brawl well, doesn't dive, doesn't spam, basically functions as a jack of all trades. And I think that she needs to function as a jack of all trades better. I don't think she's going to be an archetype brawl tank or an archetype dive or an archetype spam tank. I think, but we could find something in between that. But right now, she needs either better poke options, she needs better mobility options, or preferably a little bit of both. Also, the mythic skin sucked. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me present to you our potentially reworked Orisa. That's right. You just saw javelin spin into the sky. Now, before you lose your crap, let's talk about this. Let's actually go backwards. Let's go back to her fortify. I think that fortify should function in similar aspects, but I do think, this might be a hot take, you should be headshot during fortify. I think it's one of the worst things about Fortify. The worst thing about Fortify is that you are not able to headshot an Orisa during Fortify. I understand why it's there from a balance perspective. It gives her a little bit of extra survivability, but I just do not like that it discourages skillful play. And I think if we're talking about the first thing about reducing Orisa's survivability, that is the first thing that they need to do with Orisa. You should be able to be headshot during Fortify. It is it's the spirit of that change really bothers me at night. You know what I'm saying? You need to be headshot during Fortify. Now, we might have to tweak how strong Fortify is if that gets to be too glass, but I think that's exactly where you need to start with Orisa. And I also think that the Fortify, so I don't know if you guys know this, but when you're overheating your weapon, you see this? When you Fortify, it slows down the overheat mechanic. I think we want to keep that mechanic. And we're going to talk more about that in just a second. We might even be able to lower the Fortify cooldown, reduce its duration. I think Fortify probably lasts a little bit too long. I think it's 4 or 5 seconds, not in this code. But I could probably reduce the duration to 2 seconds and reduce the cooldown to around 10 seconds. So let's talk about the gun really fast here. So here's what we're going to do. I love the overheat mechanic with the gun. I think it's a really, really fun mechanic. So let's talk about how we can lean into that more. This is going to get a little complicated. Hold tight. Gun rework to high heat, which is at the very end of the spectrum right here. Right around here, it starts to get spectrum up, equals more spread. So it's very inaccurate, but faster fire rate. So you do more damage up close if you're in a high heat, okay? Low heat equals lower fire rate. Honestly, you could even have it lower than it is right now. Maybe not quite like Bastion primary fire when he's not in turret form, but you could even lower the fire rate even, but even more accurate, tighter spread, a little bit more poke oriented. Like I said, think kind of like Bastion outside of his turret form, not quite, but a little bit more accurate. So lower heat, more accurate, lower fire rate, high heat, faster fire rate, a lot less accurate. And then Fortified does the exact same now, where it either pauses the heat entirely or it slows down the heat accumulation. So you actually are going to use your Fortified dynamically to kind of find a way to work around, when do I want to use Fortify to maximize my gun? For example, if I'm poking with Orisa, I might even use my Fortify early so that I could get a little bit more accurate shots for a longer period of time. And that's something that if we're able to lean more into having the gun function differently at different heat mechanics, that rewards that more. Heck, you might even have a situation where if you lock in the heat with Fortify up close, you lock it in at a high heat and you keep it at high heat with Fortify, and allows you to get crazy spread here. Basically allows skill of when you use it for poke, when you use it for die, when you use it up close, and playing around crowd control. So the funny thing though is if we use Fortify in that aspect, it actually opens up some situations where you might not just use your Fortify for survivability, you might use it for your weapon, and that leads to the decisions. Decisions are fun. Having to choose between, hey, do I Fortify for survivability or do I Fortify to min-max my poke damage? That's an actual decision that you have to make now. And especially if you're to reduce the cooldown or reduce the duration of Fortify and allow you to be headshot, then that may be a situation where you use your Fortify early for poke, you take space later in the fight, and then all of a sudden you have to use your Fortify for survivability later on. Okay. I think a couple of tweaks with Javelin here. I think Javelin hitbox should be a little bit smaller. I think everybody talks about this crowd control is a little bit too easy to hit. I think just shrinking the size just a little bit, and then we're going to keep going with the gun changes. Hold tight. Overheat ties into Javelin. Ready for this? Using Javelin while overheated, so like let's say above the, I canceled my Fortify there. If you're like over a halfway through with the overheat mechanic, your Javelin does fire damage. In other words, it puts people on fire. Now, I'm not talking anything major, not anything like dynamite level, but probably like a 10 to 15 damage DOT total, right? Like 5 damage per second over 3 seconds or something like that. Just a little bit of a burn effect for a little bit of extra damage, right? Now, again, you might have to tweak the damage of how it's done and how much damage the gun does. But again, what does this do? It introduces a little bit more of a dynamic of how you utilize this. And then crucially here, talk about a 10 to 15, 20 damage DOT. One of the concerns with Javelin is that as it is right now, it is spammed on tanks. It's too easy to spam on tanks. 15 to 20 damage is meaningless on tanks, but 15 to 20 damage is not entirely meaningless on squishies. So now there's a situation where hitting a Javelin on a squishy is slightly more rewarding and slightly more important. You guys can see what I'm saying here? Something to consider. Let's talk about spin, because spin ties back to the gun as well. Give her spin verticality and probably increase the speed. I think this is by far the most important change they could be doing to this ability. I think this character lacks in mobility, lacks in ability to position herself. I'm not going to go super in detail why I think mobility is important, but I will touch on the fact that giving Orisa more positioning options, more target options is really important. Really, really important. And if she's able to get this mobility, we could significantly reduce her survivability because she has mobility. She can choose her engagements. She can choose her targets. And heck, she can even disengage more consistently. So if you're concerned about, oh my gosh, this is a terrible idea. Orisa's going to Javelin spin to high ground. She's going to walk on top of my skinny robot booty and she's going to Fortify and murder me. Well, we're going to talk about that. We've already addressed the fact that Fortify, you need to be able to headshot. You probably need to reduce the efficacy of the Fortify total damage reduction. There's a lot of ways that you could approach this here, a lot of small adjustments, but giving Orisa the ability to choose her engagements would be a huge, huge quality of life change for this character, would be so many more opportunities to focus on things other than tanks. So tanks, rejoice. You actually have an Orisa that doesn't have to only focus you. And it's just freaking fun, guys. It's just freaking fun. I'm actually planning on doing some pugs, trying this out, trying out some Orisa mobile things. In fact, I had somebody, one of my friends, one of my students actually coded this for me, so big shout out. I really appreciate this. And we might actually do some pugs with this, which would be really fun. Javelin spin also gets a one-time boop with like Diva boosters. So one of the other complaints about Javelin spin is that it boop, 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 boop. I would love to see it just be a one-time boop on the initial application like Diva boosters. And then also, okay, so you guys want to get really saucy with this? Javelin spin restores your heat meter by 0.5% per X damage mitigated. In other words, if I Javelin spin a lot of damage, my gun cools down significantly. It's not just cooling down my weapon, but the amount of damage that I mitigate cools on my weapon more. So if you're going to poke mirror, right? You use your Fortify to keep yourself cool, right? More accuracy, more accuracy. Then you Javelin spin. That not only cools down your weapon, but cools down your weapon significantly more depending on the amount of damage that you mitigate. We use it in the situations where, like, do I want to use my Javelin spin for mobility? Maybe. Or do I want to use my Javelin spin that I can continually be more accurate with my weapon? Do I want to use my Javelin spin to take a high ground? But wait, I need to make sure that I take the high ground when I'm at high heat because I'm going to be getting up close to the enemy team. So I need to make sure that I'm not Javelin spinning for space, but I'm actually Javelin spinning for mobility once I have high heat. And then when I land on high ground, I Fortify to maintain that high heat, so I do more higher DPS, and then I hit that Javelin on that low HP squishy so that I get the extra burn damage and I finish the kill. Now, that's going to be tricky, though, because I just used all my potentially defensive cooldowns to initiate aggressively, and because Fortify only lasts 2 seconds, if I don't get that assassination, I might need to disengage or maybe I even die. You guys kind of see where I'm saying with this? There's so many options here. One other thing is with Orisa, before we get to some of the sauce, shields, I think, should be able to block the ultimate. I don't like that it goes through shields. However, the movement penalty should go through shields. I think one of the broken things about Orisa potentially is the fact that she'd be able to, mobilize herself and then just use her ultimate on anything and you wouldn't be able to stop it. So I do think that shields need to be able to block it, and potentially you might even need to reduce the amount of build-up damage or whatever else. There's lots of little tweaks. So we're not really concerned as much about it's going to be broken with this number or this number. This is looked at holistically. If many tweaks are needed, that's fine. I also don't think that Orisa's ultimate should be manually hacked. I think it should only be canceled through EMP. If you don't like the Javelin spin for verticality, horizontal mobility through out of combat passive should be increased. I think if you do not give Orisa's mobility directly, then she needs an out of combat or combat passive 10% speed boost, kind of similar to like a Genji Tracer movement speed, just to at least give her some horizontal so she can choose her engagements a little bit better. Maybe even a gallop. I think you could even do where it has like Javelin speed. You could buff the horizontal movement speed of Javelin. So you see it right here. This is a little bit faster than the normal Javelin speed. You could leave in that. She actually maintains movement speed after Javelin spin right now. You could increase that even more. Maybe a little bit leap at the end of a Javelin spin. So she did a boom, a little bounce. The character needs mobility. At this point, I don't even think it's an argument. I know people will disagree with me, maybe my take overall with mobility as a whole, but there is no way to make a character that has this little mobility option and this little consistent damage mitigation and have it be balanced. You would either need to give her a shield, which I don't want to do, or you need to give her some form of mobility. There is no other way to balance it without making her absolutely unfun to play versus, and I don't think that's even really up for argument. How that mobility is expressed, how much mobility I think is up for argument, whether it's tied to Javelin spin or not is up for argument, but this character will remain broken until she has more opportunity to choose her engagements. Fundamental Overwatch. It's not even Overwatch balance, it's just first-person shooter balance. Okay. So that's Orisa. We're going to keep going through here. We're on to Ramattra now. We're almost done. And now Ramattra is a pretty saucy one. So Ramattra is another one where I think that the character has a lot of potential, but misses in some aspects. And we'll talk about some of my grievances with Ramattra. Let me pull up my notes here. Okay, so recent buffs have definitely helped with this as well. So we did this rework before recent buffs, which gave him 100 armor while in Omnic form. And basically, I think he does more damage. I think he does more damage with his Omnic form. So keep that in mind. We'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit here. Here are my grievances. I think having cooldowns like Ravenous Vortex and his shield on such long cooldowns really doesn't feel that good. It feels like inconsistent cooldown value. They're also not particularly fun or engaging to play with all the time. I think Ravenous Vortex has potential, but kind of flops. And because the shield is on such a long cooldown and is actually guys, it's 1,000 HP shield. That's actual insanity. People even in the pro levels don't even break the shield 99.9% of the time. So the cooldowns feel really uninteresting to play with. They're not super fun. Omnic form as a whole doesn't feel super engaging. There's also not a lot of a reward for balancing and managing forms a lot. This is a little bit less of an issue since they buffed the damage in Omnic form and gave him 100 armor, but it feels honestly like a lot of the time you're just waiting to use your Nemesis form. You're waiting to setting up to use your Nemesis form. It's almost all about Nemesis form even now. Block. This is one of the worst things that Ramattra has, if not the worst thing. It's such an uninteresting mechanic. The damage mitigation is unbelievably high. It's not interesting. People don't really weave it all that much outside of just regenerating HP. People don't really use it to block bursts of damage. It's just boring. It's boring for you. It's boring for the enemy. It's boring for everybody. And then the ultimate, is such a disappointment. Suffering and suffering and suffering and suffering. It's better than it used to be in terms of the infinite duration, but it's essentially just used as a Nemesis form refresh and just general AoE damage. It's not an interesting ultimate of design. It's one of the worst ultimates that Overwatch 2 has ever created, not in terms of the visual design, but in terms of the fun of the execution. It's really, really, really dull. So here's some things. I would love to see, I actually have notes here. Consider giving Ramattra 50 armor or 100 armor in Omnic, which is exactly what they did. So that's great. A little bit more survivability in this form I think would be useful. And now this is where we get to the sauce. Reduce the shield HP by at least a half, if not more. The shield should be 250, 300, 400, or 500 HP, no more. And they should consider halving the cooldown, or at least reducing it to 8 seconds or fewer. One of the fun things about Sigma Shield is that while it's a pretty easy shield to break, it gives you choices about blocking cooldowns and burst damage. You can use it to take space or to give up space. Ramattra's shield is not only unbreakable, but it's only see it once in a blue moon. And the uptime is really, really, really low. I think it's, 25%, something like that. So the uptime of the shield means that there's not a lot of counterplay around the shield when it is placed. However, it's also bad for the Ramattra because he can't really dynamically do a lot of things with it. It's the shield's committed and that's it. I would love to see a significantly flimsier shield that's actually breakable, that's utilized more to block burst damage or crowd control, and is actually up more frequently, so Ramattra can actually take space in Omnic form without being like, oh, well, my shield's down because I can't do anything, right? I think this cooldown is way too long. I think its effectiveness is way too high. There needs to be a middle ground so there's more playmaking potential of this ability. I also think that the buffing the damage is probably not the direction they want to go with this character. I would love to see I think the Omnic form damage is already pretty high. I mean, you can kind of see here, like that's pretty high right there if you hit all headshots. I would love to see the projectile speed increase slightly, and maybe even the damage nerfed if they do, because the problem with this is it's easy to shoot tanks, it's easy to shoot stationary squishies, and it's easy to shoot shields. But as soon as a Genji or a Tracer or anything moves around, you can have the world's best tracking, but the projectiles move so slowly that it's almost impossible to lead it. And so generally, even high-level Ramattras don't even bother to try. And I think that's the problem. You should be rewarded if your aim is good, if you can lead shots well. And I think because the projectile is so slow, you're not rewarded all that much. So I would love if they nerf the damage and they buff the projectile speed. I think it would make this character form so much more viable and so much more situational. We talk about the first tempo tank swapping back and forth. That's kind of a meme. But in reality, even after the buffs, there's still so much of his form power tied up into Nemesis. Talk about Vortex really quick. Very interesting ability, but very lackluster in execution. I would love if it applied mid-air by pressing the ability again. You guys remember thinking about Junkrat Concussive Mine. You can throw it out and you can detonate it whenever you want to. I want to be able to throw out Vortex and detonate it right there by pressing the ability again. Imagine throwing it in the sky and pulling a far out of the air. Imagine pulling a Genji out of the air. And even just the ability of I overthrow it, I can throw it whenever I want and detonate it whenever I want. If you did that, you might need to nerf it. You might need to nerf the size. You might need to nerf the slow. There's lots of things that you consider with, but I think the ability to throw it and detonate whenever you want would be a really, really skillful expression of the ability. Now, if it lands, it does detonate, but being able to detonate it mid-air would be really, really cool. Now, you could also do some other things with this ability. I think you could buff the vertical range of the suck, like how high it reaches. Depends on the feel of how the detonation in midair. It might not be necessary. I think you could also reduce the duration and the cooldown of the Vortex. So again, it's a really long cooldown. What if we reduced it to 10 seconds? What if we shrunk it in size? What if it only lasted for like a full second and didn't even last half a second more? I also think that there's some opportunity of how you use or when you use your Ravenous Vortex, because you can use it in both Omnic and Nemesis form. What if you had a slightly stronger slow in Nemesis form, not stronger than it is right now, but about as strong as it is right now, the slow, right? But if you're in Omnic form and you use Vortex, the slow is a lot weaker, but the damage is higher. So right now, what is it, 30 damage, 45 damage? It's terrible damage, right? But what if the slow was a lot weaker, it was like a 5-10% slow, but the damage was doubled? So it was like 80, 90, even 100 damage if you stayed in it for the full duration. So now in a poke scenario, right, something that Ramattra is tragically really bad at, which he shouldn't be. What if now you had an AoE zoning tool similar to a Sojourn Disruptor Shot with a weak slow, not quite as much DPS as a Disruptor Shot, but actually can be used to control offense and control space without just being, hey, a 3-2-1 slow and push. Imagine that with the combination being able to protract actually with faster projectile speed and having a lower cooldown shield. We might actually have another competitor for a quasi brawl spam hybrid, and a real brawl spam hybrid, not a brawl tank with spam aspects, right? Anyway, that's all I've got for Omnic Form. I think there's a lot of details you could glean from that, a lot of fun things that you could maybe do. Let's talk about block. I think that block should be on a resource meter. I think there should be a 3-second total amount of time that you can utilize while in Nemesis form, potentially recharges after a period of time while in Nemesis form, or you can even have a total amount of shield HP where if it's like you blocking, you have 1,000 shield, 800, 600, 500, 300, 200, and it breaks, right? And then you can't block anymore. I know people are like, oh, that's terrible, it's terrible, it's gonna be a huge nerf. Yes, it is. We're gonna have to buff other aspects. His Omnic form is gonna be a lot stronger with the changes that we're proposing here. But it is the worst aspect of the character. It is the absolute bane of fun play. Ramattra mirrors are terrible. Ramattra playing into Ramattra, playing as Ramattra is terrible. It needs to be buffed. He needs to be buffed in other aspects, and too much of his value is chained from just holding block, and it's just not fun design. And so yes, it's gonna be a big deal. But if you're actually able to use your Nemesis form and force actual cooldowns out and do actual damage and take actual space with a more effective vortex and the more effective shields, then you're not going to need as much raw survivability from Nemesis form. I actually think that you could also argue that Nemesis form also lasts too long as well. Could see the duration reduced as well. So the real question, though, is what does Annihilation do? Because Annihilation is something that we complain a lot about, but how do we actually solve that? There's a lot of suggestions, none of which I was really happy with. It's a really tricky one to tweak. One of the suggestions with that it could be that Annihilation actually buffs your Nemesis form. You do more damage per punch, 60 to 75 damage. It increases your Nemesis duration from 6 to 10 seconds. Slight movement speed increase so that you already have a movement speed increase while you're in Nemesis form, but now you do a slightly more. You could even have a small DOT on your punch, a lifesteal mechanic potentially. One of the suggestions is also as well that there's a combo buildup where each punch does 5 more damage. My concern with that is that it would be abused too much on enemy tanks, but the fact that you're doing more damage per punch makes it even more potentially rewarding going for backline. But there's a lot of things that you could do, little tweaks to make this ultimate more interesting instead of just the AoE DOT. I would love to see more of it tied into Ramattra directly and less into the duration itself. Couple other maybe crackpot ideas. Maybe the Nemesis hitbox is a little bit too big. We talk about how much of that nerf to the block would affect his survivability. Maybe we could tweak his size a little bit. Maybe that's going to affect the lore too much. I'm not really sure. And then also we talk about like putting Nemesis on a resource instead of putting it on a cooldown. 6 seconds max, total of 10 to 12 seconds to recharge. Allows you to selectively deal with CC by swapping back to Nemesis form or Omnic form and dropping your shield and then going to Nemesis, then going back. Can swap in and out for shield. The problem though is obviously like swapping to Nemesis gives you armor. So one of the questions was like, how do we balance that if you just like can spam going back and forth and like managing the resource to just build armor? And one of the suggestions was that you lose the armor when you go back to Omnic, obviously, but you only generate the armor from Nemesis to the percentage of a resource that you have. In other words, if I use half of my Nemesis form and then I swap back to Omnic and I go back into Nemesis form, because I haven't fully regenerated my Nemesis form, I only get half of the armor bonus. It's a tough solution. Annihilation could also cause some issues with that as well. But there's a lot of little tweaks to this character. So anyway, TLDR, we're going to buff a lot of aspects about Omnic form to make it more viable. We're going to reduce some of the worst aspects of Nemesis form to make it a little bit less frustrating to play with and against. And hopefully find something to make Annihilation a little bit more fun. Because Annihilation is really fun when you get in there and you punch and squishies in the face. You don't really care about the infinite duration as much. You don't really care about the AoE DOT. That's just not the most interesting aspect. So how can we kind of keep that hero aspect of like getting in there and you're smashing people in the face and still have it fun to play with and against? That's all I've got for Ramattra, excuse me. Let's get into Roadhog. Now, the Roadhog one is the one I'm quite frankly the most disappointed with. Not just from the developer side of things, that goes a whole nother 9 yards. But I feel like we put a lot of time into it and we just couldn't come up with anything really, really great. There's a couple of small things that I think would make the character a little bit more fun to play and maybe a little bit less annoying to play versus. But this one's a tough one. This one feels like the design is so fundamentally flawed with this character that I don't even know if there's a good solution. So just kind of keep that disclaimer. It's the first tank where I feel like we were really not able to fully succeed to a point where I was happy. But we'll throw with you what we actually have so far. So let me pull up my notes with Roadhog really quick. So what are our grievances with the Roadhog? And this is stuff that was applicable before the rework, and it's applicable after the rework too. It's just a really disappointing rework. Problems. Survivability is totally one-dimensional and very easy to counter. Now, this was addressed. This was the best part of the rework, or the worst, depending on the way you look at it, where his survivability is a little bit less situational because it's not so cooldown reliant. Because it's on a resource, it allows Hog to play around different things longer because he doesn't, my heal got interrupted. now I'm just instantly dead. Now you can actually play around that a little bit more consistently. But it still feels too easy to counter in many circumstances, whether it's through crowd control or whether it's through the anti-nade. And because it's only healing, it can feel very, very frustrating to play against as an enemy team. He has no armor. He has no survivability beyond the heal. Anti-nade, crowd control interrupts, can't multitask. So as a result, you can't reliably take space, but you can hold space because you don't have any mobility, because your cooldowns are more defensive oriented with Roadhog hook and your Pigpen also as well, very defensively oriented. It can feel very difficult to take space as Roadhog, but very oppressive to hold space. Pressure potential on non-tanks is really low without hook. In other words, especially since the loss of the right click, which was the burst, even though this is like decent damage, it's a lot worse than it used to be. So his poke pressure potential on squishies, if you don't have hook, is a lot worse. It's pretty weak compared to a lot of the other heroes. And so what ends up happening is you have a lot of Roadhog on the tank abuse, Roadhog on tank on tank violence, essentially. And that's not a lot of fun. And then you hook the squishies, and then you kill the squishies, and then that's pretty much your squishy threat. So it's the pressure potential on non-tanks without hook is low. Poke threat isn't consistent. You're very reliant on hook. Pigpen is an enabler, but it's not consistent pressure in of itself. It's a very inconsistent ability, and it's also kind of cancer to play versus. Basically more relevant in the tank mirrors. My favorite part is that they said that Pigpen was something that helped them on his frontline presence. And while that is slightly true, the fact that they even felt that Roadhog needed frontline presence and needed frontline presence from a destructible trap is just very depressing to me. Not very fun to play versus. Is it the hook one shot or not? I think that's the big question here. So what we said is, do we want to lean into a more tanky hook counterplay style, more damage mitigation, not as much healing, some dynamics with the character plays, or do we want to make it like a Sombra-like rework where there's a little bit more risk involved in every single opportunity? He's a little bit squishy overall. But he maintains that actual threat. And I think there's a lot of ways that you can look at it. So I'm not really sure. Again, like I said, I'm not super happy with this rework, but here's a couple of ideas. I don't think making him CC immune is the play. I don't think it will work. One of the suggestions was, what if we made Take a Breather do less healing overall, but more damage reduction? Visible damage reduction that you can consistently see. So that he has some sort of mitigation besides just raw healing, which means that he's not quite as vulnerable to anti-nades, interrupts, and things like that. One of the suggestions that I liked is I would love to see a small speed boost on Take a Breather, where, again, we talk about a character that has basically no mobility, even and also limited range. I would love to see a small 10, 15, 20% speed boost on Take a Breather so that he's able to take space more consistently, make plays, take off angles, things like that. Now, I can already be like, oh my gosh, Flank Hog Terror. Again, there's just nothing about Roadhog that's going to feel good. If you can give Hog some sort of mobility with the Take a Breather, allow him to move a little bit quicker, take off angles, sort of horizontal mobility, then I like the Orisa rework. You're going to be able to take away some of his survivability elsewhere. You might need to reduce his hook range, though, because you are going to be effectively reducing his hook range by giving him a little bit of mobility. But yeah, maybe a small bit of armor. You could also give him a budget 1 second duration parry fortify that doesn't cleanse status effects but gives CC or slow immunity. You could give him a separate cooldown. You could have it tied into Take a Breather. There was a lot of suggestions of that. We weren't really able to find something that I was particularly happy with. But I think you could do something along those lines, which might be fun. I think maybe you could also reduce the cooldown on trap. I mean, 12 seconds, again, is such a long cooldown. And I would love for it to be manually detonated so that whenever you want to, even if people don't walk directly over it, you can use it to zone an area. Because remember, the AoE of the ability is larger than the detonation. So it detonates there. And the AoE is actually large, it's going to hit all the way over here, even if you don't walk over it. So being able to manually detonate the Pigpen, I hate the ability, but if we're going to lean into it, I think that would be really useful here. One other little detail as well, is that I think you could actually have a function where you could click and hold. I don't know how you would do this, but it would be interesting if there was a charge mechanic with his weapon where you could click and hold and charge and then release, and it would tighten the middle spread, tighten the spread just a little bit for slightly better poke, slightly better range, a little bit more range pressure. Your rate of fire would significantly be reduced. But some way of incorporating that would be really, really nice. The problem with Hog, though, is that it feels like, especially since Pigpen has been added, there's you have your hook, you have your heal, you have your shot, and you have your trap. But it feels like there's so many buttons, and none of those buttons feel particularly good to use. So I think that the problem with a lot of these suggestions is how are you going to incorporate that? It's just more abilities, whether it's the parry, whether it's the manual detonation. Well, manual detonation trap would be easy enough. But even the charge mechanic might be really cool. Might be really tricky. Excuse me. One of the other suggestions, if we're going to lean into the mobility, is to give him some sort of a lunge, a roll, a belly flop, a chest bump, some sort of mobility with slight damage, like a boop, a bump, something to roll around, to move around a little bit quicker. There were some suggestions about maybe giving over health from breather so that he's less vulnerable to anti-nade. Maybe a cap of how much over health. I think the guns change was also really disappointing. It was probably something that they did so they could compress his button so they could actually use the right click for heal. The problem is that took a lot of the skill away from the character about calculating the range. But the most skillful thing and the most fun thing with the Roadhog was hitting those right clicks. And that is now gone. It's now just left click spam and more left click spam. So I think I understand why it was taken away in terms of buttons, but I do think that would be, it probably won't come back, but that is a very frustrating change, I think, for me. Take a breather reduces duration of status effects was a suggestion. Grapple hook. You could have a way to where you could change the type of hook that you have, where you have a grapple hook for vertical mobility with limited range. That would give him a little bit of verticality. Again, you would have to tweak the hook as a result, but definitely would make his positioning a lot more interesting. I like that kind of idea. I think it'd be a fun experimental patch to see how it would feel. Again, like the more mobility positional options that there are, the less survivability the character needs. You could even tweak the hitbox. And then another thing people were saying that like you could remove the tank passive and ult. This is more of a quality of life change for people playing versus Hog, because as it is right now, Hog, because of the tank passive with boop, means that you could just absolutely obliterate tanks because they don't actually get booped as much as the squishies. So like, yes, it would be annoying to be booped as a tank, but it'd also be nice to not actually get absolutely one shot by the Roadhog ult. So as you can see, especially compared to some of our other reworks, a little bit lackluster. I think some of these changes, even just done in isolation, would be fun. Might make the character a little bit less frustrating to play, maybe reduce some of his frustrations. But I think this character may just be the ugly stepchild for as long as Overwatch lives, which is kind of sad for me. If you have any suggestions for Roadhog, I would be very curious to hear what you guys have to say. But that's it. My mouth hurts. I'm exhausted. We've been going for over an hour here. But basically, the goal is to give more characters more options, more dynamics, more counterplay, more skill play, and more fun options. Remove some of that worst aspects of playing with the character versus the character and as the character. Let me know if you guys have any questions in the comments, and I will see you in the next video.